Hello, hello. This is Are We Woke Yet? Your favorite podcast. Uh, and
Yeah,
today,
we're back with. Sorry.
no,
I was-
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're back with a new episode, and this time we're gonna deconstruct some myths that are usually held about Cuba. But yeah, uh,
Yeah, it's going to
because
be probably our first episode from the series of Socialism Misunderstood, where we're going to talk about different countries and how socialism worked for them and some misconceptions held about socialism in different regions. And we wanted to talk about Cuba first. But before we get to the subject, we obviously did not record an episode this Saturday because we both have been just swamped with work and a lot of things have been happening in the world. So we were just going to briefly talk about that. So Leo, what's been going on with you?
well, my work is actually covering all the stuff that's happening in Brazil, and right now it's fucking crazy because I was all over international media that judge the Supreme Court minister here, he annulled all the convictions against Lula. So that's three cases that were annulled against the ex-president. Um, and though the judgment of the Supreme Court minister was very much processual, wasn't really talking about the things that people want him to be looking at, which is the fact that the ex-judge who was conducting this case was like suspect. I don't know if that's a correct term, but he was impartial basically.
Yeah.
Uh, and that was proved through messages and all of that. So the decision was very processual. But what it meant is that his political rights are fully restored. And that's the politically relevant fact that people have to deal with now here because it completely changes the game. Um, so next year we have presidential elections. Um, and Bolsonaro will have the opportunity of extending his 4-year mandate.
Do you think
Uh,
he has a chance? Like, is there a lot of support for him?
I think it's been going down for sure ever since the pandemic started, because of all the things he's been doing, uh,
He's
rather
not
not doing during the
handled it,
pandemic.
right?
Completely mishandled it, and every single day I have to write a single or more than one article about crazy statement that he made. Like yesterday or 2 days ago, I think I was writing about how like it's actually outrageous. Um, he was at this conference and he was speaking, and he said something along the line of, "Oh, like stop crying, everyone. We can't rebuild this country with all of you crying." Something along those lines. It's crazy because you look at the numbers and we have 260,000 people dead
Yeah.
through this pandemic because of this, virus. And yeah, like I think people have been realizing how bad he is. Like just looking at the polls, it looks as if it's been reduced a little bit. Like when you're looking at election polls, of course you got to look at like different scenarios, right? Um, so you got to look at who he's positioned against in those polls.
Yeah.
Um, and like in the polls where Lula wasn't even a name in the questionnaire, he was polling very well still. Um, but yeah, all the polls considering Lula as a candidate, Lula wins in all scenarios actually against all potential candidates. And yeah, so that completely changes the game electorally, right? And that's the reason why actually he was being held in prison, is because people realized the appeal and the strength he has here, and they just try to keep him down through all these illegal practices that are just being uncovered now. And yeah, we've actually been doing much of the uncovering of all of this that's going on. It's crazy. Every single day is a new sort of batch of messages and audios comes in, and we just have to go over everything and find what's relevant. And yeah, so like we like to think that we're actually helping in this process, and that's what's exciting about it as well. um yeah, so that's actually some good news. I'm
No, it's
happy for it.
good. And you're bringing awareness. That's really cool. I think that you're working on the case as well.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I couldn't be
Or
happier
is
with
there
what we're.
anonymity now? You're gonna get death threats. Hopefully not.
Yeah, I hope I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
And what have you been doing?
Um, yeah, so obviously things have been happening in Poland for a while with abortion bans or like abortion restrictions, but also yeah, last week, well now 2 weeks ago, there was the pregnant woman who set herself on fire in the refugee camp on Lesbos. Um, so we've been trying to protest that as well. I mean, protest not her setting herself on fire, but basically she tried to commit suicide, and she set her tent on fire while she was in it. She just took her kids outside. She didn't die, but the tent was destroyed. So now she's being charged with destruction of property, which is ridiculous. And the only reason she
Being
tried to,
charged.
yeah, and the only reason she tried to commit suicide is, commit suicide. She tried to die by the act of suicide. I think that's the more proper way to say it. Um, is because the conditions in the camp are terrible. I mean, pregnant women sleep in sewage water. They're bitten by rats. The camp rarely has electricity or running water. And many people call the camp hell on earth, and it's actually true. And she's been already staying there for a year with her family, and because of her pregnancy state, I think she was like in the last phases of pregnancy, they told her that she can't be transferred to Germany, I think. And upon getting to know that, she wanted to kill herself. So we've been trying to protest that to the Polish government as well, to accept more refugees in, because obviously that's an issue that no country, especially now during COVID, a lot of the migration has been halted, right? And the process is way more difficult. So that has been kind of on my mind, and it's just been really fucking sad. And yeah, we've been protesting that because it kind of goes as well under the slogan of the Polish like women's strike protest, which is "You'll never walk alone again," kind of. Yeah. So we wanted to stand with her. And then yeah, yesterday for the International Women's Day, we've been protesting the near complete abortion bans in Poland. So now, as of recently, abortion's only allowed in cases of like rape, incest, or where the pregnancy threatens the life of the mom. Which is, yeah, it's just ridiculous because the abortion cases didn't drop. They're now just done illegally and obviously in less safe conditions. And yesterday, it's been, I don't know, it was one of the protest itself wasn't one of the biggest protests, but I've never seen this much policemen in my life. And it was actually a really fucking scary experience. So yeah.
It's like containing or being violent.
Well, the thing is, they're just really scary. So they come in like big vans, and there's more and more of them, and they're gonna start like surrounding you and getting closer.
And they come very fast, right?
Yeah.
And they always stop right next to you just so you get scared.
Yeah, but then as well, they would start during the protest enforcing things that make no sense. Like, I was standing on a pavement, not on the street, and they would be like, "You have to leave. You're blocking the street." And I'm like, I literally was not blocking the street. Where I was standing, there wasn't that many people, and you could still pass. And then they start, getting closer and closer to you, and then obviously they start pushing you, and then people push back, and that's how kind of you start fighting with the police. So it's to the point where, legally they didn't instigate it, but they did.
I mean, you instigate the violence.
Yeah.
Was there violence?
Well, yeah, like people get tear gassed. You'll get
tear gas.
Yeah, some people got arrested. It's just in generally, it's not a very nice experience, especially that the protesters are not being violent.
A very different way of spending International Women's Day. Like
Very different. But I mean, it's that way all over the world, I guess. Like women go out and they protest, and right now because of the pandemic, they have the ability to say this is dangerous. We're in a pandemic, so you shouldn't be gathering on the streets.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just personally, I've been emotionally exhausted and really sad for the past week, and I don't know.
It must be really draining seeing all these stories of women just setting themselves on fire, right? It's
I mean, it's just
like,
makes you feel really fucking helpless, And as well, like yesterday, I ended up like crying in the protest because like I remember, well, at least for my generation, I've been going to this protest since 2016 when the bill was first introduced. Like it wasn't yet the law, but it was introduced. Um, and you kind of lose hope at some point, and I know you shouldn't, but you're there again and
meaning,
again.
but I'm not sure if like in Poland the same thing that happened, not here in Brazil, but right next in Argentina happened, which
Yeah,
like
they
because of this,
thought, yeah.
but did it not ever get legalized or
No, it's been
lifted
so
that
the
portion?
introduction of the more strict, well, near total abortion ban was first introduced in 2016 as a possibility, and that's when we first went to the streets. And we've been like quite good at protesting it, and then the pandemic came, and it was way harder to organize, and people would still go out, but they kind of used the pandemic to pass the law. But the thing as well is, it's not
What's
about.
the situation now? Sorry, like is it completely banned? It's banned, you said.
No, I said it in cases of rape, incest, or if the mother is gonna die. That's when it's allowed. But that's like
It's actually regressed despite of the protests.
this, yeah. Uh,
Wow.
and obviously, a lot of it is, well, at least personally, I think a lot of it isn't even about women. It's about a lot of it. I think is about them mishandling the pandemic and coming inflation. And whenever you want to distract people with something, women is like the first target. Because it's easy. You're gonna be like, oh, so I'm gonna take away these rights, and obviously when we're gonna protest, and it kind of takes the society's attention from other issues that
Yeah.
easy to pass other laws then while people are focused on this.
Because like COVID is tearing through Poland, right? It's
Yeah.
as well as very bad over there,
I mean, yeah,
from
things
what
are
I saw.
kind of open, kind of closed. It's kind of underground open.
Yeah,
But yeah, the cases are on the
I know how
rise.
it is.
So yeah, not great.
Yeah,
So that's why
like
we just couldn't. On Saturday, I messaged Leo and I was like, I physically cannot sit into the podcast. And I think you also were quite tired.
yeah, no, that day I was working as well. But yeah, so that's the main reason why we couldn't record the episode on Cuba. Um, so yeah, should we move
Yeah,
on
should
and
we
talk
get
about?
to Cuba?
Okay. So yeah, like we thought we through these series we be talking about countries and trying to change a little bit the way people perceive them. And there's a list of countries we could talk about. So we could talk about Cuba, we could talk about Venezuela, we could talk about African countries that have socialist governments, but are always perceived as well as sort of being hostile. Um, and Cuba was top of our list. And I think one of the things that shocked me the most recently about Cuba and the whole COVID situation, if we could start talking about that, is how well it's actually dealt with COVID. Because I see a lot of, discourse here in Brazil happening, demonizing Cuba, demonizing Venezuela. And if you just look at our own situation, it's despairing. We have 260,000 people dead because of COVID. We have new variants of coronavirus emerging every day.
Yeah.
Like the projections are the worst. they could possibly be. And yet we're talking about other countries and, pointing the finger and saying, oh, look how bad socialism is. And if you actually look at what Cuba's achieved in this pandemic, it's remarkable because they have their own COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
So that's Soberana 0202. I don't know. And yeah, it's done a remarkable job at containing cases and tracing contacts and just keeping
Usually
the
when
transmission low, which has been the case all around the sort of communist world, if you like.
yeah,
Um,
I was just gonna say that I think
Vietnam.
in general when propaganda happens, when it's written against socialism and all other issues too, usually people will focus on all the bad things, and if there's any success stories, they're just not going to be mentioned because they don't fit the narrative of socialism kills and is bad.
Yeah, exactly. It just doesn't fit the narrative. So I just pulled up here. The Cuba has, of course, it probably has a lower capacity of registering all cases and deaths and so on, but it's registered 56,566 cases, 873 in the
We
last
have
24 hours,
population
and
as
only
well.
350 deaths.
Like obviously Cuba's population is going to be smaller than Brazil's. More similar to Hungary in
Yeah.
terms of how many people live there.
Yeah, it's got a population of about 11 million people.
But still,
But yeah, I mean, still 56,000 cases is extremely low for any place, actually.
yeah.
And yeah, I was actually looking at Vietnam as well, more specifically recently because I had to write a piece on it and how well it's actually doing with COVID as well. And it's implemented like a crazy tech system of contact tracing. And it's done so many government campaigns to promote, personal hygiene, not personal hygiene, but sort of social distancing and sanitary norms and all of the um, all of those measures against COVID and has done remarkably well at containing COVID. And it's been the case throughout the socialist world, and it challenges our perception of
I wonder maybe that's a little bit of a
China as
stretch.
well.
Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but I wonder in terms of people's mindsets in general, when you live in the capitalist society, you're kind of taught to live like it's kind of each for their own, but like everyone fights for themselves, regardless of whether like the person next to you is hurting. That's kind of the main idea of it, right? Like if you work hard enough, you're gonna be okay, and everyone kind of thinks about themselves. Whereas again, maybe I could be wrong, but I think in
Yeah,
general, the idea of like socialist countries as well as the idea of a community, and you look out for other people and for people as a whole. So that can
I
also
think it is related to that because
you just
uh,
you're brought up in a different mindset.
yeah, and it's also not just about the individual persons. I
Yeah.
think that logic also applies to how the healthcare system, for instance, works. So what you have in those countries is an extremely efficient healthcare system, um, and they just have the capacity to adopt those measures because they just have the reach, right? They have the capacity to sort of tell their whole population about social distancing measures, and that's what a state-based healthcare model looks like, really. And they have provision, of course, for all people who need treatment, and more than enough provision if everything works fine, right? So uh, I think that logic of, you know, mm, I'm not sure if it's cooperative spirit or just uh, it's just sort of like a more welfare based model, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and it's you see the effects, right? And you even see them in China, which is the first epicenter of the pandemic, right? And people constantly demonizing it for, being the source of the coronavirus and so on. People don't even know if that's the case, but it's just the first outbreak that happened there.
Yeah.
But
But
so
also
if you look at what they did, and how they completely just shut their cities entirely, and how the system has a capacity to do those things in those countries that are socialist. I think it's challenging people to see um, a bit outside of the propaganda.
I
People
mean,
might even start noticing.
in general, there's been a big rise in I think even like talking about socialism because of the pandemic. You know, Teen Vogue. It's like the magazine like Vogue for teens. They even like had a little article in socialism, which is something that like wouldn't even be thinkable before, you know? Because people are starting to turn into it because they see that capitalism isn't working, and like healthcare that's only for the very few people isn't working, obviously, in the times of a fucking global pandemic.
Yeah, I think one thing that people are seeing as well, and that's related, is that the alternatives that the system proposes, they're always bullshit alternatives. So, usually is the case that you have the system, for instance, in the United States, making you choose between someone like Donald Trump, who's a complete lunatic, and someone like Joe Biden, who's not a lunatic, but he does the same things that Donald Trump does on the political, economic, social level. So the alternative that you're really fighting for is alternative of appearances, right? And
Yeah.
people sort of believe in that naturally because they believe in those statements that these guys make. But the real alternative, and I think that's what's key to understand this pandemic, lies somewhere else. Because when people start getting this understanding that healthcare, for instance, should be a human or is a human right, and you should have all these social provisions that work sort of like disaster contention modes
Yeah.
in the system. That already calls for a system where the state is more present, where the economy is a bit more collectivized, and yeah, essentially, I think it's changing people's perception as well. But if we could go back to Cuba, right? Uh, they probably did that. My research didn't really go far, and you know, go as far as looking at exactly all the policy measures that they implemented. But yeah, it's just a remarkable feat.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable as well is that their healthcare
Is one of the best in the
system
world.
is sorry.
Is one of the best in the world.
Yeah, it's one of the best, and is one of the most like. It's just different the way healthcare is perceived in Cuba. It's really the centerpin of many things in their society, from what I read, uh, because their whole vision about healthcare is centered around things like basic care, for instance,
Yeah.
that makes sense within a system that has to reduce, costs already. And throughout its history, throughout the history of revolutionary Cuba, uh, healthcare has been like the centerpin of their foreign policy almost, because uh, what happens with Cuba is that they're doing this now as well, uh, especially in Latin American countries and African countries. They send teams of doctors and medical researchers and medical products from Cuba to those places all over the world, and they just help the local healthcare system uh, sustain themselves. And to me, that's something rare, right? You don't see countries usually doing that, and um, especially in this sort of area, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think Cuba is just remarkable because of that. And it's just, as I was doing my research, I found that it's managed to actually eradicate some diseases in the Congo, I think. Just pull that up.
I think it's gonna probably go back to, not go back to, but go into something we're gonna talk about later, which is Cuban Revolution being very transnational. Um,
But
what
if I can just quote this, Cuba assisted Italy, Andorra, France, and Caribbean nations, and had a history of doing so in the area of healthcare. That's what I wrote down. So in 1963, I think that's when the war was going on. I sent a medical team to Algeria, And in the Congo in 1966, it conducted the first mass vaccination campaign in the whole of Africa.
Yeah.
Uh,
But
so
that's what I mean. I think in general, that's what I said, like that we're going to probably talk about it, but even more later about, yeah, the transnational impact of Cuba. And that goes for like medical issues and healthcare, but also for inspiring revolutions and for like supplying the means for revolutions as well. Um, in other countries. But I think in general, what we were talking about healthcare and how it's central to Cuba's socialism, I think this is quite interesting because even in times when there was literally not very much food products on shelves, the healthcare system was still thriving and it was still free for all, and the medication was still free for all. And it was also central to Castro's policies because I think 2 years before he died, he was still working on like pills that he could redistribute to all Cubans that would be free, that would offer them all the nutrition that they need because he knew they're facing shortages in food. And so like the medical side was always very central to his policies and well, to Cuba's revolution and Cuba's socialism.
yeah, like I remember reading about those pills once, and I was quite shocked by it. I was like, maybe this is
If people are
something
interested,
strange,
a part
but
of
it
it,
actually.
it's talked about in Cuba and Cameraman. It's a documentary on Netflix about this guy who visits Cuba, I believe every like 5 years for 50 years. And he actually develops a little bit of like a friendship with Castro. And he gets to see him 2 years before he passes. And he talks to him about those pills and how he hopes it's going to be revolutionary. And yeah, it's really cute.
I once met a guy who also interviewed Castro,
Really?
and
He was such a funny guy. Such a funny guy.
it's, it must be crazy just being a journalist and going to Cuba at that time. You know, probably some shit going on with the Soviet Union and US, and you just go there to Cuba and you see Castro in his little island, and it's all very scenic. He's got all his military gear. He talks to you about communism while smoking his cigar. It's like I just imagined this whole journey this guy made when he was telling me about it, and it was something that stuck to me. It's like I want to do that one day. But
Okay, wait. We should probably stay like focused now because we keep on blabbing and blabbing. Um, well, okay. So I think it would be important. Well, I just kind of wanted to state first that we're both of us, we're not historians. And this is just like our personal knowledge in Cuba, and it's also not the like absolute truth. It's just something that we believe in. Oh, and I also just the reason why I wanted to talk about Cuba in the first place is actually my mom, because I remember she went to Cuba a couple years ago, whatever. And she came back and she was like, everyone's so poor and it's terrible and this
I think I
socialism.
remember when you were telling me. Oh, that was fairly
Like
recently, wasn't
multiple
it?
fights about this, like multiple fights.
But it was in uni time. It wasn't too long ago, right?
Yeah, it was like a couple of years ago, I think. So yeah, she went
I
to
remember you were telling me about that.
and she was presenting to me a perspective that I've heard from so many people before that, and she blamed it all on socialism, and she was like, you see, this is why socialism is bad. And I remember at a time I didn't really have the tools to explain to her, like I could just get angry and be like, this is ridiculous. um, so that's why I kind of wanted to do a bit more research into Cuba's history as well, and just to kind of articulate why this is not the case a bit more. And by this is not the case, I don't mean that Cuba is not poor, because it still remains quite a poor country. I'm saying the case is it's not because of socialism. And that's what I was
Right.
interested in, like diving deep into its history, and I guess most importantly into its like colonial history and semi-colonial history, and kind of walking people through to why Cuba could be poor today.
Yeah.
That socialism is not to blame.
One thing that's key to understand as well, I think, even before we start this debate, is sort of what we mean by poverty. And I'm not trying to be one of those guys who, of course, is covered in privilege and is just saying, "Yo, look at these people in Cuba. They have all they need." Like that's not what I want to say. But what I'm trying to say is that when you say there's a poor country, you're talking about a country that's probably not industrialized.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the sense in which us both see Cuba. It's a poor country in that it is not industrialized. It is not sort of like a relevant part in the global chains of production. It doesn't have a national bourgeoisie or anything like that to even, call it an industrial powerhouse. But even the socialist state doesn't um, manage to do that. And that's one side of it. But the other side of it is that there isn't much poverty. And it's actually really hard to find statistics on Cuban poverty, actually. I couldn't find anyone.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
and what's important when we talk about poverty is that we're not just thinking about people who are in such an extremely low condition that they're dying on the streets. Because Cuba, of course, as we were talking, has, for instance, an extremely good healthcare system, um, well, sort of monthly, what do you call it, benefits to people.
Yeah.
And it's got all this social net of benefits that provide for people that don't make it really a poor country.
But I also think it's important to remember that Cuba might be like a poor country within like the Western lens, obviously, and it still might be a poor country. But also, I think we should look at why that is and who benefits from Cuba not thriving. That's why it's important to not look at it as an like isolated island, you know, but rather it's kind of like, I think the topic of neocolonialism would be quite important here, and funds like, IMF, which actually keep small countries being poor, and like how GDP is calculated, how this is a Western concept, how all these countries are kind of a lot of the times kept poor to allow for later like military interventions or humanitarian interventions, and it keeps ties to the
Yeah.
ex-colonial powers, which allows for neocolonialism to happen. And that's exactly why those countries remain poor within the Western lens, where on their own they could thrive.
You're saying like the international powers, whoever that might be, they have a vested interest in keeping Cuba poor because that probably means that eventually the whole population is going to rise up against the people who are in power there. So it's just economic strangling until you get a popular response, which, is, a strategy that's extremely unethical, right?
Yeah.
If you're strangling a population, literally, if you're starving them, you're not giving them food that they need. Cuba's an island, as you say, it can't
Yeah.
produce all the food that it needs. So suddenly you have an embargo. What that means is that people go hungry, and when they go hungry, they get angry against the government. Probably that's the logic that they're trying to.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
in general, in that documentary as well, the Cuba and the cameraman, in the beginning when he started visiting Cuba, everyone was like quite pro-government and they enjoyed socialism. Obviously, only like the elites fled to the States. And then progressively, people become annoyed that, there's not enough food on the shelves, and they start praising the US, and they're like, oh yeah, we want to go into capitalism, we want to flee. And even they themselves, like, they get influenced by this US propaganda, and the American dream. And they turned their backs on Cuba too,
That was before the revolution. I imagine that must be
that's
a shit ton of.
after
Yeah.
revolution. But yeah, in general, yeah, I think we should look at Cuba's history before we speak about way before socialism. Because I think it's important to say that Cuba was never a rich country within that lens, It was for a very, very short period of time, during the First World War, it was kind of like thriving, we could say that, because it had the monopoly on sugar. And obviously
When was that again, sorry?
it had, I think it had either the monopoly, it was like produced a lot of sugar, and most of the travel routes were banned because of the World War. So they were actually exporting shit ton of sugar.
Yeah.
But that was an
Yeah, I
issue
remember reading up on that as well.
because they wanted to produce this much sugar. Well, not because they wanted to, but because there was the need for so much sugar, they stopped, or not stopped, but they minimized their production of tobacco and other things. So when the world ended, markets, international routes opened again, and then when the market crash happened, they suffered a lot because they were actually overproducing sugar. The prices were really low again, and they had nowhere to sell it to.
You're talking about the First World War.
Yeah, First World War. But even before that, we're going to talk about, they were under, they were a colony of the Spanish since what, 1492 or 96? Let me look it up because I had it written somewhere. So it's 1492. That's where Columbus came to Cuba. And they've been under Spanish rule for 400 years. So that's a lot of time. And when that was happening, obviously they were really freaking poor. A lot of them were treated as slaves, and also slaves were brought to Cuba from a lot of African countries.
Guess what you had in Cuba as well as something analogous to what you had in Brazil, probably, where you had I'm not sure about the percentage of the slave population. Maybe in that regard, it isn't that similar, but it's similar in that, when you had those Portugal, Spains of life conquering Latin America, they were just extraction-based colonies.
Yeah.
So in the case of Brazil, it was gold. They literally pillaged all their gold, took it to Portugal, and then that's it. That's
Yeah, no.
But with Cuba as well, I imagine it must have,
Well, it was similar because you saw that they had quite a bit of resources, a lot of fish. You could like produce tobacco. Most of the native population was killed by the diseases that Columbus and his people brought to the island that they weren't accustomed to, and they were already laboring very hard. Basically as slaves. So most of them died. And then the Spanish people that came then owned the slaves that came from different African countries. So Cuba was basically, built by Black people mostly. Wait, I forgot when I was going with it. But yeah. Yeah, so I was just gonna say that it was obviously like a very poor country, and then right after, from the Spanish being a Spanish colony, straight away it was taken by the U.S. And by taken I mean it was freed under the humanitarian intervention, and the U.S. was fighting off the Spanish to give Cuba independence during the
U.S. had so many
Cuban Spanish.
It's crazy when you look at it because the United States has literally colonies out there, right?
Yeah.
Like it had until, historically, in historical terms, fairly recently, Cuba, it still has the island of Puerto Rico. And it had the Philippines as well. Like it was an empire, like literally an empire that, controlled those countries. There's Guam as well.
I think that's what was quite interesting, because during the Cuban-Spanish War, technically what the US could do if they actually just wanted to intervene and stop the war, they could have just helped Cuba fight off the Spanish and then help them get independence. What they did instead,
that's never what the US is going to do, right?
No, obviously.
If we learn anything from history, that's never what the US does.
But that's what I find ridiculous, this argument that still exists within the US academia as well. It's that, it was a humanitarian intervention. And without the US, Cuba, was this helpless little baby that wouldn't be able to fight off the Spanish people, which it's probably true. The fight was unwinnable, according to historians at some point.
And Cuba just was probably forced to get help from the U.S. and the U.S. just probably imposed
Well,
conditions upon them.
apparently a lot of the like Cuban elites and a lot of people at a time thought that the only way out is to get help from the US. What they didn't expect is that when they were creating their constitution, that the US is going to try and impose different parts of the constitution. So they had something called the Platt Agreement, I believe, under which the US would get Guantanamo Bay. It still had to have like shares in Cuba's production. So it basically created something that's called semi-colony, which today would work just as like a neo-colonialism.
It had literally an empire,
Yeah.
and that's the case with several Latin American countries. You have the United States. I think actually, right at that period of history, you're talking about sort of after the world crisis and after the Second World War and all of that, and during the Cold War, especially during the Cold War, the United States basically saw Latin America, and it still sees it to this day as this sort of back garden. You can just do anything. You can just, put some dictator here and there, and then
I think, yeah,
defend
I
its.
think the first president of independent Cuba was actually backed by the US.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so
I
wait,
remember.
I found my notes on it. So it was the Platt Amendment, and yeah, that authorized US to establish military bases in Cuba and gave them Guantanamo Bay. But also, they promised that they will give them independence in exchange of American property being protected in Cuba.
Mm, that's an interesting one because right, that doesn't sit well with socialism, of course.
No, of
You
course.
can't just have protect. You just can't have an American property in a socialist land, right? It just makes no sense. So they probably just had to get rid of all of that.
Well, some
And
historians also claim that it's because the US saw the revolution before the revolution even began. And they couldn't really have like revolutionary thinkers and a revolutionary country near Latin America. Like it because they knew it would inspire too many movements and they needed control over those territories.
I think one interesting fact before the revolution as well, as it was sort of you know growing in people's heads, probably. I remember when I was studying history in high school, and one of the things we talked about is how at that moment in time, Castro wasn't exactly what you would call communist revolutionary. So at that time, with the country in that sort of dire economic situation, and with the United States, you know, big power, big control over the country, you had him not necessarily being too anti-American, but it was over time that that anti-American sentiment grew, and it was actually over time as well that those measures against, for instance, American companies were implemented. They were implemented right after Cuba became a socialist country. So the revolution uh, might not have even been too much of a socialist revolution. It just became that. It was probably something about national affirmation of national identity, that was, of course, lacking throughout this whole history you told us.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of national identity grew together with the socialist project. Um, so you see today is.
I think it's interesting though because Fidel himself was never necessarily that anti-American. I mean, he was very sweet when talking of American people. He was never really rude. And he would always say that like he admires their courage and that they fight for what they want. But on the opposite side, America was always very anti-Castro to the point when he would visit New York, like none of the hotels would take him in. And the only hotel that took him in, I think, was in Harlem. and that's where he also like met with Malcolm X.
Wow.
Because the only population, like part of the population of the US that liked Malcolm X was the Black Americans, because he saw like the comparison of like of similar struggle and I guess like the US establishment. And yeah, apparently there's also been a lot of attempts at his life. And what is funny is that he never wore a bulletproof vest. He was like, yeah, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die one day.
Yeah. Like
And
that guy probably survived so many
yeah,
assassination attempts that he doesn't even care anymore. Like, because with assassination attempts, they could happen at any time, right? It could just be someone sticking a bomb to your, bread toaster, and it just explodes on your face in the morning. And that's it. Like that's what the CIA was trying to do.
yeah.
Like because they had those crazy assassination attempts, right?
But then he died of natural age, natural causes. I what
He
not
died recently, right? He
yeah,
died like
it was
when I was in uni. I remember that.
I think, which is crazy.
He lived like more than 90 years for sure. You he had good health.
Yeah, he had very good health. But I think, yeah, so and here it's important to say, because that's something we didn't say, but we did also wanted to make a case for Cuba being completely a victim of the American forces, or Cuba being simply, Soviet Union's pawn, because that's usually the two arguments that are
Yeah.
presented. And I think it takes away a lot from the Cubans themselves and their agency. And that's,
Yeah.
I think it's important to talk about Cuba being this extremely powerful drive for so many other revolutions. And that's kind of as you talked about, as well as like, medical help and revolutionary help around the world. And then also having this transnational solidarity with the Black Power movement in the States. I think it's quite interesting because Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, they both sought like asylum in Cuba for a little while they were facing struggles in the US. And you had this sort of like, I don't want to call it like a brotherhood or sisterhood, a kinship between the two causes, two revolutions. And
Yeah.
obviously, Castro was also the one who inspired Che.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that you talked about that I thought was good to expand upon was uh, this idea that socialism in Cuba was simply a copy of the Soviet model, which, from what I read, doesn't seem to be the case.
I
So
think it's
it
it's
is.
definitely, I don't think it's even like an art. Maybe it is an argument that it's a copy of a Soviet model. I think it's something we talked about before we recorded the podcast. I'm just before you speak, I'm just gonna quickly mention it. Um, that when people speak of socialism, a lot of the times they imagine this one big concept that is, it's kind of like a little block that could be put in different countries, and it's going to have a same effect. And that a lot of people argue that, oh, if socialism fell somewhere, it's inevitably going to also not work somewhere else, just like maybe over a longer period of time. But it's important. It's kind of like with feminism, it's not, there's no one socialism, it's socialisms. And Cuba, as you previously mentioned, has a very specific um,
It's
social,
very.
yeah, inherent to their
I
culture.
think it's very important to make this distinction because people often think that, and I think that's probably because of propaganda, because they're inclined to see socialism as being something evil and monolithic that if it happens in one country, it means it's happening in all the countries that are socialist. And but if you look at actually existing socialism, which is what I think is important to look at, what are the actual examples right now in the real world
Oh, I was just gonna
that
say that a lot of the times I listened to this lecture today um, about this college professor who said that most of the time when he speaks of socialism, his students think it's a synonym for communism, Marxism, anarchism as well. Like people kind of throw it all into one box, which only shows you
I
how
mean, they're not
confusing it is.
wrong. if you just look at all those perspectives, they're actually not wrong, because what it means is you have to look at all the elements that comprise it. So it's not a single thing. Uh, what happens is, if you look at socialism as being simply the collective ownership of the means of production, and you
Yeah.
try to find actual examples of that in the real world, you're just going to have to come to the conclusion that socialism doesn't exist in the real world. It's not being applied anywhere. So what exists, and that's the case for Cuba as well, is something different from what the Soviet model was, from what the Chinese model is, and so on. So Cuba has a set of conditions that are very particular to it. And we talked about that. We talked about how national identity always lacked in that country. So socialism had to become something that could mobilize people,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. It had to be something that people could really unite under and believe in. So the message that socialism in Cuba tries to, expound is very important. But yeah, so if you look at what the distinction of the model of the Cuban model is, you have nowadays room for private enterprise. I think recently I even published a piece on this. I don't remember very accurately the facts, but um, more room was made for private enterprise in certain areas of the economy. And it's actually quite a significant chunk of the economy that's now, privatized. Of course, it exists within a socialist structure and all of that within the socialist society, but there's room for private enterprise, a lot of room for international tourism right now as well. And I think that's what the provisions they made recently were about. But throughout history as well, you had a sort of adaptation happening to the time period. So, after the Soviet Union fell, that was a very heavy hit for the Cuban economy, and they even have a name for it. They call it the special period. And the special period is a period of extreme necessity that the Cuban people had to go through. And it was all because the Soviet Union fell. And what it meant effectively is that the prices of the crops that Cubans were exporting weren't
Yeah.
fixed.
Plus, they were getting financial help from Soviet Union as well
Yeah,
here.
they were getting a lot of financial assistance. And the
But also,
main assistance that they were getting was the tying of the price with, uh, the sort of like Soviet scheme, and not with the international market. And when that shock happened in the Cuban economy, it just threw everyone into poverty.
yeah.
And it took them a while to recover. And the way of recovering, it
And then
seems,
later on
Mhm.
top of that, you had the embargo.
Sorry.
I said that you had the fall of Soviet Union, and then on top of that, later you had the US embargo, which basically just
Yeah,
like
for sure.
consecutively you had this inability, like one after another, you had this inability to get up economically.
Yeah. So what their socialism had to do effectively was navigate those exact um, situations, right? So uh, what socialism in Cuba was trying to achieve was find a way where the country could uh, stabilize its finances and really find a national industry to rely upon, and that happened to be sugar. Um, and socialism in that case isn't really about uh, that vision of, being an industrial society with collectivized means of production, right? It suddenly becomes something different when we're talking about the Cuban case. So it has that characteristic of being adapted to its economic reality that I think is very important to emphasize.
Oh,
For all countries, that's the case. It's never a monolithic model that's imposed.
I also wanted just to say that before turning to Soviet Union, Cuba was never anti-US. It was more that US was just very anti-socialism, that the kind of their agreement didn't work, and also the fact that US was exploiting Cuba. And after it wasn't benefiting from the agreements that they've made with the US, that they turned for the help to Soviet Union.
For sure.
I think it's important because a lot of people think that it would be just, because they were socialists, that's why they would hate the US, which was never the case. It was kind of the other way around, and it was the only way for them to go was
Yeah.
to turn to the Soviet Union.
The United States, in military industrial complex, that's actually the term that uh, began to be used at that time of the Cuban Revolution, because it was Eisenhower who really created the idea of the military industrial complex. But the military industrial complex has its own hawkish interests all over the world, right? And it tries to maintain that regardless of democratic norms or ethical norms, and it has its own logic, and it applied that logic against Cuba essentially,
Yeah.
and it still does to this day. It's still uh, this sort of massive military machine that's observing everything that's happening all over the world, and
Oh
it's very
yeah.
daunting. But yeah,
I also wanted to add that looking at Cuba through this lens of a helpless country that has to be rescued from socialism um, is inherently racist. And it's very much, yeah, again, in the progress narrative of, us West, we know what's best for the less educated, less developed countries, and we have to save them. And that's very visible in the US propaganda over time, over the time of the Cuban Revolution, but also later, where I was telling you this before we started the podcast, but that Cuba was a lot of the times called the damsel in distress, which was very like gendering towards it, that it's, in the times, so it's a woman and it has to be saved by the American men. A lot of the times people there were also called, savages, and how they need to be taught how to be civilized and how democracy has to be introduced. And um, I just wanted to say that maybe it's not this maybe not this explicitly, but maintaining the discourse of, we need to save Cuba from itself, and we need to save it towards what we, and by we I mean like the Western countries, view as appropriate in itself, is just very fucked up.
yeah, it's almost like they make their presence seem necessary to
Yeah,
people, right? Because
exactly.
if they're telling, even, and that's something that's visible within Latin American countries, how much that perception about the United States being some sort of force for good in the world, how prevalent this perception is in Latin American countries. And it's all because of this extremely effective propaganda that tells people that basically without their assistance, and this propaganda happens sort of like implicitly. It's not necessarily a post that you're seeing on social media, or
Yeah.
some media ad. It's what the government and the media conglomerates is what they all talk about all the time, and they give you this idea that without some sort of say trade liberalization, or policies that end up hurting the poor because they have to cut costs, like all these things, they express this logic of favoring the interests of capital, and making it seem that uh, the only alternative is between accepting that power of, say, the United States or capital, and uh, rejecting that other side, that of potential solutions for this problem that lie outside this logic.
Yeah, it's basically like but it's also, yeah, it's creating the issues for the country and then denying them the help unless they agree to more of their freedom being taken away.
Yeah. And it's extremely effective because of that. It gets to people's guts almost. And yeah, you see that with Cuba. You see that all over Latin American countries, basically. But yeah, like I thought just to reemphasize that as well is, despite the lack of industry in Cuba and despite the lack of, what people in the West would associate with a big economy,
Yeah.
and that is probably, paved roads and flashy, glass, tall rise buildings. Like despite the lack of that, Cuba isn't extremely poor, right? It isn't
But yeah, but it
a
also
place
makes
you wouldn't want
sense
to
because
live in because actually it's got all the provisions, the basic provisions. And if you look at the numbers, one thing that I was actually very unsettled about is I couldn't find actual statistics on poverty. My expectation was that after the revolution you would see a clear reduction in poverty, but I couldn't even find those graphs.
but we talked about it
But
in the
just looking at the other
yeah.
sort of indicators, you have, you know, the best indicators for healthcare in Latin America, in the world even,
But we saw
and
better literacy raised in the US as well. There has been
exactly,
it has been doing in terms of numbers better than the US. It's just, within the capitalist system, obviously the selected few thrive, and the selected few are often, white and able and men. And that's what you kind of get showcased to the world, and the flashy roads and the big buildings, and you never really get to see the extreme poverty and the lack of access to healthcare that is everywhere in the US. It's just
yeah,
nothing that's ever talked about because that's the ugly side of capitalism.
yeah,
Whereas
exactly. It's like people here,
redistribution.
like the United States should never be proud about its healthcare system. It has no right to, be talking about that even. So it just makes its propaganda machine completely, um, it's raining heavily here.
I put someone
Um,
standing
like
outside
the
your
windows are
door,
banging,
and this is when you're getting
but
murdered. I don't want you to get murdered, but you never know.
yeah, it's just heavy wind and rain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was talking about what was it talking about? Yeah, uh, like the indicators of health and all those indicators, they point to
But in
the
general,
fact that Cuba isn't really a poor country, and that's the basic fact that people have to accept.
but my thing is sometimes, even if it was pointing it at, which I know is not, I think it's more of like a broader issue, but we should really look into um, the means by which we measure countries like success, poverty, everything, and how those systems were developed by the West, and how
Yeah,
it will obviously be slightly biased as well. And even the concept of human rights, and I'm not saying necessarily against human rights, but they will vary depending on cultures, and it's something that is very inherently Western and then will be imposed and will be often used as like a justification of, again, another interventions that will only assert neo-colonialism in different regions, and like the basis of breaking of human rights when they're not always broken. Which, yeah, again, I'm not saying human rights are a bad concept, but it's important to just keep in mind that they are all Western concepts.
yeah, they work within a Western framework that might not apply to different places, and that might have different ideas about what human rights are
And that's
about.
also just another
Anything.
point is, I think, no matter what political fraction, I don't know, what political beliefs I hold, I think it's impossible to say that like capitalism will work for everyone. It's impossible to say socialism will work for every nation. Like it's so individual, and to have this idea that one system can be applied everywhere in the same way is simply dumb. And I think
Yeah.
the idea behind like capitalism being global, that's why it doesn't work and it only works for a few nations that, you know, profit off of smaller nations, is because it wasn't meant to work. It's dumb.
I mean, sorry, I got lost in what you were saying. You're saying that
I
the
was
idea that socialism being
oh I
like a
was
monolithic
yeah,
thing is dumb, or
no, I
in,
said
in,
the idea of capitalism, that it could be unanimously, like unifiedly applied everywhere and have the same kind of
yeah,
like benefits, is dumb, because it was designed to only benefit like the few larger nations at the expense of the smaller ones. But I was also saying is I'm not necessarily saying that socialism will work everywhere in the same way, or that it will apply to every country, because they are so different. And in general, I'm very opposed as like one notion of one system that's going to work everywhere.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it goes back to understanding it as it really happens rather than just in theory, which I think is sometimes the trap that even people on the left they fall under,
Yeah.
is especially in academic centers, I think. They fall under the assumption that what they're saying is necessarily how it applies in all places, and of course you have, you know, different factors that could affect that and alter the outcomes. And I guess with socialist theory as well, that happens, right? Because
Oh,
you have people trying to say it's just
I just
you know, collective ownership, or just, I don't know, some idea of, you know, welfare that should be provided to people. It is way more ramified, and it can be applied sort of like isolatedly as well. So you can sort of like have a socialistic healthcare system and still exist within a capitalist
yeah,
society as well.
I think that's
So those contradictions exist.
it's also the difference between like public and private socialism. Like you can have like private socialism existing within like when the public, the state, there is no state socialism, you know, like you can have a socialist company that like
Yeah,
you can have, it's not, I don't know, like universally applied within like one country. I just wanted to say that for the research for this, it was even within JSTOR, it was hard to find articles that were not pro-American. But also today before the podcast, I was like, I'm just gonna type in Cuba socialism into YouTube. Oh my God. All the first videos are like,
what's
um,
the algorithm trying to tell you?
no. One of them is American people coming to Cuba with food, and there's this food market, and the narration goes about something like, poor starved Cubans have not seen the delicacies of the American culture and food, and now they,
That damned
for the
algorithm
first
is
time
just
in
feeding me
years,
lies.
and you have these like people like fighting over food, and this like little lady from Wisconsin like showing them like some corn or whatever, and they're like, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
so tasty. And I was disgusted. Like, it,
Like, dude, like this argument makes no fucking sense. Look at what's happening in Texas, right? Or like what's happening in Texas like a couple of weeks ago. The shelves were empty. Look at what was happening like when the pandemic was booming, you know, in March or April. The shelves were empty. The system has the capitalist system as well has no capacity to support those sort of like heavy shakes that it can get from the world all of a sudden, and it just cannot withstand some crises. And I think that goes back to something that we talked about earlier as well. I'm not sure if it was in this podcast or before, that people should start now seeing socialism or socialistic policies, whatever you want to
socialism,
call it, socialisms,
yeah.
uh, as the actual alternative to the situation, the predicament that we live in right now. So a real problem is people are convinced by the narrative that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to save the world. And they actually are just fascinated by this image, and they miss the understanding that these guys, they just exist to keep the system running. And what has to come to the fore is the realization that actually a socialist alternative is what this pandemic calls for, cries for.
I think it would be interesting if you would want to at some point, maybe when we're gonna talk about socialism in Venezuela, we could also just do a little history in terms of because I don't even know if people are kind of aware of like maybe they are of the history of different systems, because we could talk about feudalism and how that later changed to capitalism, then the socialist idea, and then communism, which actually arrives later than socialism and is kind of a part of
Yeah,
socialism. Yes.
it's more like an economic, very macroeconomic world history.
Yeah, I think we could just do it as like a short, like 15-minute version, because yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's just interesting to understand it more. I also don't know if people are gonna get anything from this episode. We're kind of all over the place, but
Yeah. I
I
think we talked about
hope
some good things.
yeah, I hope it's still understandable. And also, if anyone wants to, just email us, because I have a lot of the articles that we use for this podcast, and I have access to them because
Yeah,
I
me too.
study. So I can send you some PDFs if you would like, if you're interested. And I think so. What are we going to record one more podcast today?
The one about the thing you wanted to do.
Yeah, we just wanted to do like a really dumb podcast. Because yeah, again, coming back to what we started with, a lot of things are happening right now, and I feel like for the next week I'll probably be busy protesting again.
So we'll probably just record a short episode about just dumb shit and
Yeah,
yeah.
stay
I just
tuned.
gotta make sure I go to the toilet before,
Oh
otherwise
yeah, for sure, we're gonna have time to pee, don't worry. Well,
I'm gonna
okay,
blow up.
is it all? Have we talked about all that we wanted to talk about?
I think we've explored all of the themes
I
that
do
we
have to
wanted
say
to.
I'm very biased, because Fidel Castro is one of the, like, he's the love of my life. Whenever he speaks, I blush, and a lot of the times I cry. And if you don't have anything better to do today, watch his UN speeches, because they're so fucking powerful, and it's so ridiculous that what he asks for is not even the standard in most countries, like, yeah, free healthcare. And he's like funny. I cannot, he is the love of my life, and he's unfortunately dead. Um
He's like one of those, I don't know, dudes that you just get near him and you probably feel his presence already because of all that he's accomplished.
Wait, what is his
Like,
his most famous quote? It's the one with like, history will absolve me. When he was tried for the first time and he went to jail,
I mean,
he had this quote of like, convict me, history will absolve me. I think that's what he said.
let's see if I can find something. There's a book called History Will Absolve Me.
Well, that's what he wrote in jail, but before, he said to the journalist in the room, he said, I think it was, convict me, history will absolve me. And that's his book was later called.
Yeah, I can't really find the quote.
Like manifesto.
I found a selection of quotes, staring quotes. Oh, from actually a very good portal for Latin American news, which is called Telesur. It's the Venezuelan state media.
In the description box.
Yeah, that's actually a super good link for us to look at, because it's looking at Fidel Castro's history will absolve me in 10 stirring quotes. Let's just pick one. I'll just pick a random one. Say a number from 1 to 10. So let's see.
9.
9. So there's a whole paragraph. Let me read it. Castro later questioned the integrity and valor of the court's justices, reminding them that as a younger man, he had requested the judicial power to try Batista, the president before, for crimes against the republic. So the quote: You will tell me that on that occasion the Republic's justices did not act because force prevented it. Then confess. This time force will also oblige you to condemn me. The first time you couldn't punish the guilty. The second you'll have to punish the innocent, the maiden of justice, twice violated by force. That's an intense quote.
It is. Also, yeah, if
Like talking about
anyone's
being violated by
interested,
force
I
and
think
being abandoned.
history
Like,
is quite interesting.
yeah,
Because he was raised among like peasants, but he was an illegitimate child of a very rich man. So he lived in the disparities because because he was a bastard child. I think until he was 4 or 6, his father couldn't really be in contact with him. So he lived with the help, and he literally lived like in both worlds,
yeah.
and that's how
Like this idea of contrast, I think is very like
yeah.
it's very consciousness forming sometimes because with inequality, and especially in his case, he could probably get a sense of what it meant to be poor, but also what it meant to be rich. And
Yeah.
I think that awareness that that life condition brings is super valuable because it taught him about the injustices of the system and his own country. And
Yeah.
of course, from those experiences, he became the revolutionary leader that he was.
Yeah. I mean, he also became the revolutionary. Well, not that's not why, but he had a lot of political power because he married into a very wealthy family. Very well who that held a lot of political power too. But I think when he was in jail, his wife was forced to by his family to divorce him. But that
Right.
he even got into like a position where he was listened to.
Yeah, I mean, like that sort of like shock of wealth seems very big in his biography from everything that I read as well. Um,
Okay, wait. We've been talking for a while now, so I think this is the end. If you guys enjoyed what you've heard, please subscribe, um,
yeah,
like this video, share it with your friends, send it to your aunt, send it to your mom who thinks Cuba is poor and socialist and
I
bad.
send it to all your friends who believe in the propaganda.
Yeah, no, just send
I
it to
think they
your
will
friends
like this
who
episode.
wanna.
Actually, they'll hate this episode. That's
That's the
what we
thing.
should expect as well.
I
But
don't necessarily like the idea of more people watching us because I'm quite shy, but at the same time, I want to get more responses. Like when we ask, like, oh, what people want to
yeah,
hear from us next, I want to get a bit more than like
yeah,
5 responses. I want to have more of like a dialogue with people. So
yeah.
if
So people,
people listen,
please
send it to your friends
dialogue with us.
and
Please
message us. No
contact
emails.
us.
We've got no emails, only DMs on Instagram. And I know that's kind of like easier, but I do love a good email. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Feel
please
free to hit my email box and whatever,
hit me up.
all those services. So yeah,
Okay, this is it.
that's the end of the episode, right?
Love you guys. Wow, that was a weird kiss. Bye.
Okay, bye.